So, I am going to keep going through Matthew's 5th section, which I have called The Suffering King Explains His Kingdom. And as always, I try to make those statements, those summary statements as complete as I possibly can, and I think that does summarize things that are happening here in this part of Matthew. Today's passage overlaps some with the passage from last time, so I'm going to start back at chapter 16, verse 24, and we're going to read through chapter 17, verse 9, which is a lot of ground, but it really all flows together. So starting in verse 24, Then Jesus said to his disciples, "If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and will then repay every man according to his deeds. Truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John his brother, and led them up on a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his garments became as white as light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 tabernacles here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and behold, a voice out of the cloud said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell down to the ground and were terrified. And Jesus came to them and touched them and said, "Get up and do not be afraid." And lifting up their eyes, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down from the mountain, Jesus commanded them, saying, "Tell the vision to no one until the Son of Man has risen from the dead." So today, my title and main idea is a preview of kingdom glory, is the way I've worded it. So preview of kingdom glory. And have to do probably some defining here, especially for the kids. So preview. What is a preview? For those of you kids who may not know what that word means. A preview is when you get to see a little bit of something before it's time to see all of it. So you get a little bit of it here beforehand, before you're actually ready to see the whole thing. Maybe you've been to the movies at some point, and you're getting ready for the movie to start, and before the movie actually starts, they play all these little snippets of other movies that you might want to see sometime soon. Those are previews, because you're seeing a little bit of something before you see the whole thing. So that's what a preview is. Now, in this passage, we see a preview of kingdom glory in the Transfiguration of Jesus. Now, Transfiguration, another big word here for you kids. To say that Jesus is transfigured in this passage really just means God made him look different. That's actually just what the word means. In Jesus' case, being transfigured, it means he goes from looking like an ordinary guy to looking very powerful and wonderful and glorious, and so much so that the disciples were pretty amazed by all this. So that's all we mean by being transfigured. Jesus was made to look very different, much greater than he looked before at this point. Now this transfiguration, as I said, provides a preview of the glory of Jesus' kingship. And that is the main idea that I want to stick here in front of you at the beginning of the message, under which you can put all the other ideas of this sermon. Now for the first disciples of Jesus, the Transfiguration was certainly a preview of his future reign as king. For those men who first saw this or first heard of it, if you're the 9 disciples who didn't get to go up on the mountain, it very much is a preview. Because for those men, Jesus had not yet ascended up to God's right hand to rule as Lord of heaven and earth. which he would do relatively soon, but that had not yet happened. But what those men saw on the mountain was definitely a preview of that time when Jesus would inherit the glory he had from before the foundation of the world with his Father. They got to see a little bit of that before Jesus' enthronement at the right hand of God. But of course, even for us, it's still a glimpse of the future, still very much a preview, because when Jesus returns to the earth in some future day, the whole world will be like that mountain where Jesus was transfigured. That very brief scene that we see here in this passage is going to take over the whole world when Jesus comes back in his second coming. Until then, all we have is this preview of it in the story about the Transfiguration. This is our glimpse ahead of time of what it will be like, or what Jesus will be like in particular, when he finally returns to the earth. So in all ways, we have this preview of kingdom glory in the Transfiguration. As I discussed this, I broke my notes into 3 points here. So I'll give you the 3 points of my outline here at the start. Number 1, the promise made to the disciples in chapter 16, verse 28, is fulfilled by the Transfiguration. So what Jesus says about them not tasting death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom, that refers to the Transfiguration, which follows right after it. Point 2, the Transfiguration of Jesus is a preview of the kingship of Jesus, which is really our main point. So it's in that second point that I'm going to really try to hammer that idea home. And then thirdly, through the Transfiguration, God gave these men exactly what they needed in order to face persecution. And this is where we bring the whole account back to its context, where it begins with Jesus telling the disciples, and even telling the disciples what they're going to endure, but also telling them what he's going to endure. And the Transfiguration very much fits into that, and I want to make sure we get that before we leave the passage behind. So on that note, just to stay very bluntly here, with every act of Jesus, there is a purpose. There is no randomness to these things, and there is no randomness to the Transfiguration. The Transfiguration may seem to come out of nowhere, but it does not. It very much has a point. And I think it's necessary to say that with regard to the Transfiguration, because it is so odd. It is definitely one of the more unique stories in the Gospel accounts. It corresponds to no typical kind of miracle in the 4 Gospels. This sort of thing just doesn't happen often, even around a man like Jesus. It's not a healing. Jesus is always healing people, but the Transfiguration is not a healing. It's not some kind of dispute followed by a miracle, which you do sometimes see Jesus do. It's not anything like that. The Transfiguration is certainly a supernatural event, but it is not like the other miracles in the Gospels. To use the word that Matthew himself uses, that Jesus himself uses, he calls it a vision there at the end as they're coming down from the mountain. He says, "Tell no one the vision until the Son of Man has risen from the dead." So that's what you have here. What we have here is a vision, if you will, a place where the heavenly world and heavenly realities kind of breaks through for a little bit into the earthly realm, and you get to see a little bit of what really is. But that sort of thing just does not happen often in the 4 Gospels. And the temptation is to read this passage and say, well, that was really something, and then move on, because you don't really know how to process what you're seeing or what you're reading about. What do you actually do with this? That's the temptation, just kind of remember it as an unusual event and then move on. Well, I want to consider more carefully the role that the Transfiguration played in the lives of the first disciples, especially as they looked ahead to a life of persecution likely to come to an end in martyrdom, which is exactly what Jesus tells them in the passage prior to this. He tells them what their future holds and what it takes to be a disciple. And what I want to do tonight is show you how that connects into this vision that God gave them of Jesus transfigured in his kingdom glory. So that's what I really want to do. And through these men, I hope we will come to understand better the way God deals with us as well, in terms of just how God helps us in his mercy as we face our own trials in our own lives. In our worst moments, we can think of God as being distant, especially when there aren't visions and things happening around us. But God is not distant. God is just very exact in his mercy. And I think you do see that here in this passage So I want to talk a bit about that exactness of God's mercy and how it plays out here in this passage, and then also related to us. So that is a tremendous task. Jared was asking me if I'm going to be teaching in a normal amount of time tonight because we have battery issues, but hopefully I can get all this in a certain amount of time here. So point 1, the promise made to the disciples in verse 28 is fulfilled by the Transfiguration. The promise made to the disciples in verse 28 is fulfilled by the Transfiguration. Now that promise in verse 28, there at the very end of that passage in chapter 16, before we get into the Transfiguration, is puzzling. Definitely makes a lot of people scratch their heads, but context is still king for understanding that. It is like the sole, like the foundational rule of Bible interpretation here. Context is king, and we do not forget that as we come into this promise here in verse 28 and trying to figure out what it means. To restate the promise again, Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." So that is the promise. There are some standing here, referring to the disciples, of course, some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Now, a lot of people read that and they think, first of all, the second coming of Christ, the return of Jesus to the earth after, he departs to be with the Father at the right hand of God, the second coming of Jesus. A lot of people think first of that. So what I want to say first is that we do not need to think of this verse as a description of the second coming of Jesus. It is very natural, I admit, to think that way. Many Christians read this verse and first think of the return of Jesus to the earth, which we are all still eagerly awaiting. And that kind of is the problem with reading the verse that way, that we're still waiting for that. That is the problem. Jesus says that some of the disciples will be alive when they see the coming of this kingdom that he mentioned, see him coming in his kingdom, that they're actually going to see that. But all of those men are dead now, right? I mean, all of them, all of the original disciples are dead and gone. They are undoubtedly, seeing Christ right now, but in a much different way than what it seems like if we're referring to the second coming here, because Jesus has not yet returned. So it's like, well, if he's talking about the second coming, and that hasn't happened yet, and all the disciples died, what do we do with this? And of course, the world tells us exactly what to do with it. They kind of tell us to throw our Bibles in the trash can as we walk out the door and forget about Christianity because, hey, Jesus was wrong in this thing. Well, my point is all of that is premature because that is not the way we should read the passage. We do not need to think of this verse as a description of the second coming. In fact, there is a much better way to read it, a way that actually has arguments in its favor. So what I would say is this, that Matthew and the gospel authors generally and the rest of the New Testament provide us with 5 reasons to believe that the Transfiguration is being promised in verse 28. So Matthew, the gospel authors in general, and the New Testament give us 5 reasons to believe that verse 28 is not a promise about seeing the second coming, but is in fact a promise about the Transfiguration coming up in the following verses. So I'm going to go through all 5 reasons for you. The first reason is that 3 Gospels link the promise with the Transfiguration. So 3 Gospels link this promise with the Transfiguration which follows it. So 3 of the 4 Gospels describe the Transfiguration. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all describe the Transfiguration. John does not. Okay, that was his choice. John does not describe that event, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke do. And in each of those 3 Gospels, the Transfiguration is immediately preceded by this promise of Jesus that some of his disciples will not taste death until they see him coming in his kingdom. So 3 of the 4 Gospels, and all of them that record these events, go straight from the promise to the Transfiguration. That is how they record these things. And that is impressive in itself because the Gospel authors often follow their own unique order for the events they describe. They're clearly not all going chronologically. They kind of have their own way of shaping the narrative and their own outline for telling these stories about Jesus. And very often they depart from one another. getting a point where Matthew, Mark, and Luke all tell the same stories in the same order is actually somewhat rare. But here they do that. Here they go straight from one story into another, each of them doing the same thing, from the promise to the transfiguration. But beyond that, these three authors do something else that further links this promise with the transfiguration. There's something else that all three of them do, and that is they all three give the number of days between the promise and the transfiguration. In Matthew's case, it says 6 days later after he makes this promise. He says 6 days later, the transfiguration happens. And all of the gospel authors do something like that. They give you a number of days between the one event and the other, which is also very rare. Chronological markers of any kind in the Gospels are very rare. They're just kind of telling the stories and not really giving you a calendar to go by. But here, they say so many days later, this happened. So that seems important as well. And what that tells me is the three Gospels link the promise with the transfiguration in this way. They do it by ordering them together, all three of them do, and then by giving the number of days. That tells me that the coming of the Son of Man in his kingdom is the transfiguration, and that Jesus was promising his disciples to see this event that unfolds for them on the mountain. That's my first reason. My second reason to believe this is the number of disciples mentioned in the promise and during the transfiguration. So here going to the number of disciples involved in these events. In verse 28, Jesus promises that some of his disciples will see this. So he says, "Truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." So some of them, not all of them, just a handful of them. Well then for the transfiguration, Jesus chooses 3 disciples as his witnesses. The other 9 are left down there at the base of the mountain, wondering what in the world is going on, while the other 3 get to go up there and actually see this. So you see some of them go up the mountain to witness the transfiguration. Jesus says that only some of them will see this coming in his kingdom, and then some of them go up on the mountain, but not all of them, to see the transfiguration. That numbering, or that I guess you could say that partial admittance of the disciples there, implies that the transfiguration is what Jesus meant when he promised his disciples that some of them would see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom before their death. He meant Peter, James, and John, who saw the transfiguration on the mountain. That's reason number 2. The third reason to believe this is the meaning of the word kingdom. This operative word here, not just in this passage, but in much of Matthew's gospel, and especially in this 5th section, where the suffering king explains his kingdom. One of my reasons for summarizing it that way. So kingdom. You have all been paying such careful attention, of course, to my past messages that I do not have to explain the meaning of the word kingdom. You all already know it. But just in case you have not been doing so, I will explain it again anyway, just in brief. Kingdom. Okay, kingdom. The Greek word we translate as kingdom, basileia, is the Greek word for that. Now this word, the point that I usually make first when I talk about this word does not primarily refer to the territory ruled by a king. It does not refer to lines on a map that are called a kingdom. This word basileia refers to the status of the king as a king. It refers to the rights and privileges and status that he has as a king. The kingdom is really him. The king is the kingdom in a sense. Now oftentimes that means kingship, maybe, would be a better translation for this word. You know, speaking of maybe the kingship of God or the kingship of heaven and all that. And of course it raises the question, why do we not just translate it that way? If that is a more accurate meaning, if this word refers to the status of being a king rather than the territory of a king, why don't we translate it that way? Well, the answer is the English word kingdom at one time did refer to that. It actually did refer to the status of being a king. When a king referred to his kingdom, my kingdom, he wasn't referring to the lines on the map he called his. He was referring to his rights, his privileges, his rule as king. And then there was this shift in meaning, as happens in many languages. And so now we're just kind of stuck with that word kingdom for these things we see in the Gospels and in the New Testament, and I guess really in the Bible for that matter. But the word originally referred, both in English and in Greek, to this idea of the status of being a king. So, bearing that in mind, when Jesus says this to the disciples, when he promises them that they will see him coming in his kingdom, he does not mean that the disciples will see his territory. He does not mean that they will see, the realm that he rules or anything like that. That's not what that means. It means they will see him as king. They will see him coming in his kingdom. The rights, the privileges, the status, all that it means to be a king. They will see him displaying those things. They will see his kingship. And then, having made that promise, immediately after that, 3 of them see Jesus transfigured, when he becomes glorious, when he shines like the sun, when his garments become whiter than light. And I think I can safely say that Jesus never looked more like a king in all of his time on earth than in that moment. You think about the kingdom of God and this Messiah that's coming, and the glory that will be there, and the caliber of person that the Messiah is supposed to be. Behold Jesus on the mountain transfigured. That's what you're waiting for. That's what you're expecting. That is the kingdom of God that you've been looking for. And they saw Jesus in that kingship, in that kingdom, in the Mount of Transfiguration. So when you understand the meaning of kingdom, you see that the Transfiguration is the fulfillment of Jesus' promise that some of them would not taste death until they saw him coming in his kingdom. Those are linked very much by this idea of the kingdom and what it is, what that word means. That's my third reason. My fourth reason to believe this is the Old Testament source passage, the passage from the book of Daniel, actually, that informs this whole narrative. So the whole idea here is the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Okay, you might hang in on those three items. The Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Now, all of those ideas are from Daniel chapter 7, verse 13 and 14, which I will go ahead and read. Daniel 7, verses 13 through 14. I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. And he came up to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. Okay, so in this passage, we see one like a son of man. And we see that Son of Man coming to God, and God gives him a kingdom. So we see those 3 items, the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. And that means, therefore, that Matthew 16, verse 28, very much indebted to this passage. And of course, this is not the first time the Gospel of Matthew or anyone in the New Testament makes reference to this Daniel passage. It is a very tremendous passage for the early Christians in the New Testament. But certainly here we see the influence of Daniel 7 on Matthew 16, verse 28. This promise is based on these key ideas from Daniel 7. They show up here in chapter 16 at the end, very much through Daniel's influence. Okay, so what? How does this prove a link between the promise made in verse 28 and the Transfiguration, which follows after? Well, through the source passage in Daniel 7, we can actually link the promise to the Transfiguration event, because Daniel also has influence in that passage as well. In the Transfiguration event, there is also this indebtedness to the imagery from Daniel 7. One of the most enduring images of Daniel chapter 7 is the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven and in glory. Those are 2 more operative ideas in there, coming with the clouds of heaven and in glory. So do you see those anywhere else? Maybe nearby, maybe here in the Gospel of Matthew somewhere. Well, chapter 17, the account of the Transfiguration. I'll read you 2 verses. Verse 2, and he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his garments became white as light. Some might call that glory. So there you have the glory from Daniel 7 showing up in the account of Matthew 17. Then verse 5, while he was still speaking, a bright cloud overshadowed them. And behold, a voice out of the cloud said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." So in Daniel 7, you see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven to God. And here on the Mountain Transfiguration, God is present, and this cloud is there as well. So you see more of this imagery from Daniel. So all that to say, the Old Testament source passage, Daniel 7, connects the Transfiguration to the prior promise of Jesus that some of them would not taste death until they saw him coming in his kingdom. Daniel chapter 7 is in both the promise and the Transfiguration story. Therefore, there's a link there. And we should see the promise as referring to the Transfiguration. That was my fourth reason. I have one more reason, my fifth reason. And that is because Peter interprets the Transfiguration in this way. We're going to go to 2 Peter. I promised you something from the rest of the New Testament. So this is where we're going, to 2 Peter. 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 16 through 18. We're going to see Peter's interpretation and application of the Transfiguration. 1 Peter 1, verse 16. For we did not follow cleverly devised tales when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. For when he received honor and glory from God the Father, such an utterance as this was made to him by the majestic glory. This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. And we ourselves heard this utterance made from heaven when we were with him on the holy mountain. So Peter here describes the Transfiguration. If you didn't pick up on that, that is the event he is describing. He speaks of being with the Lord on a mountain in majesty when God said, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased." That's the Transfiguration. I mean, that is exactly what he is describing there. So you have here Peter reflecting on that event, the event of the Transfiguration. Now, notice this other word Peter uses as he talks about this. Going back to verse 16, he says, "Made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ," which is one of the key words in that promise that was made to them before the Transfiguration. You will not taste death until you see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So you see here another key word, keywords not just from the Transfiguration, but from that promise that immediately preceded the Transfiguration. Peter has both together in his mind as he talks about that event and as he writes these words. Which means Peter interprets the Transfiguration with wording from the prior promise of Jesus about the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So again, there's a link there, the way Peter interprets this event, the way he sticks those two things together. So on the basis of those 5 reasons, I say the promise made to the disciples in verse 28 is fulfilled by the Transfiguration, that the one refers to the other. So it's not the second coming, it's actually this Transfiguration event that follows right after. And that is point 1 of that message, which is quite an exhausting point to make. A lot to cover in that, but we have more to do. My second point. This really is the main point. The Transfiguration is a preview of the Kingship of Christ. It is the preview of the Son of Man. It's the Son of Man coming in his kingdom as a preview of the overall Kingship of Christ. Now, to show you this, we need to dissect some of these statements and then stitch them back together again. So we got to cut them all up and then put them all back together again, which is messy business, and it was very messy writing these notes. I think I rewrote this section more than any other section, just trying to make it clear, but I just want to make sure the effect and the implications of the Transfiguration really are there in your mind properly, the way Jesus would have you understand it. So, before his promise to the disciples, in Matthew 16, verse 27, Jesus describes the culmination of his kingship. I guess you could call it the grand finale. I guess, of this earthly phase of the church age, and I guess to some degree it's the beginning of his real, of the fullness of his reign, but in some sense the culmination of his kingship. Verse 27, "For the Son of Man is going to come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and will then repay every man according to his deeds." You have the final judgment. Jesus was enthroned as Lord of heaven and earth, at the beginning of the church age, but it's at the end there where you really see his kingship come forth in the final judgment, where he is actually showing his lordship and repaying every man according to his deeds. So Jesus, though he was Lord, let's just start there. He was Lord of heaven and earth from the time he rose from the dead and ascended to his Father, right? That's how Matthew's gospel ends. All authority in heaven and earth has been given unto me, right? And then he ascends up to his Father at the right hand of God. Hard to get higher up than that. I mean, the kingship of Jesus really did start back then. We should remember that point, that the kingship of Jesus is not totally future. The kingdom of God is now, because Christ is reigning now as king. However, Jesus reigns from heaven at the right hand of God. So he's up there in the invisible world, and people don't see Jesus reigning. Here on the earth, no one actually can see with their own eyes the fact that Jesus is king. And most people act very much as though Jesus is not king, and have no care for this idea that Jesus has all authority in heaven and earth. Maybe as an example, you have some nations in the world today whose governments are so weak they can't really exercise authority over their nations, and there's quite a lot of anarchy there, a lot of turmoil that they just can't control. To some degree, the church age looks a whole lot like that, this current age where we are between the first coming and second coming of Christ. Jesus does reign, but he reigns in heaven, and wickedness is not restrained. It is a time when, even as the gospel goes forth, there is also great wickedness. And the good news is this gives time for mankind to repent as the gospel spreads. It's very much a grace period in which God does not stomp these things out immediately, but gives mankind a chance to repent. The bad news is there is a complete neglect of truth and peace and righteousness and justice and joy, which cannot be allowed to continue, which at some point has to come to an end, or else this universe is not moral, this universe is not right. God has to step in and correct these wrongs at some point, and someday that has to happen. God has to step in and call an end to this grace period and put things right. And that is, of course, why Jesus will return to the earth and call an end to this grace period and finally judge the nations, call off the chance to repent, and begin to repay every man according to his deeds. And that is what we see in verse 27 here, when he says, "The Son of Man is going to come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and will repay every man according to his deeds." And I have called this the culmination of his kingship because it's the only thing remaining. So much of what was promised about Christ has come true to some degree, but we haven't yet seen that final judgment, which is the day in which his kingship is fully displayed to everyone, the day when every knee will bow and confess that Jesus is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Not just us bowing and confessing that right now as his faithful servants, but even those who have opposed him, they will see the kingship of Christ in that day, and they will not be able to deny it. That is, therefore, the culmination of his kingship. Speaking of which, verse 28, going back forward again here to this promise that was made. Jesus promises that some of his disciples will see that kingship before they die. They will see, to some degree, that status Jesus has as king. They will see that. They will not just see him as the wandering preacher going around Galilee, doing all these good deeds. He promises they will see him, to some degree, as king. They will see his kingdom, which I'm sure will be a great comfort to those men who were just told a few verses ago that they are going to be persecuted, and persecuted rather horribly. They have to endure crosses and carry them, which means ultimately they're going to be nailed to them and crucified. But in verse 28, Jesus counteracts the grievous nature of that news with the promise that they're going to see his kingship. Surely that would be a comfort as they're about to face, as they know they're about to face, to some degree, these injustices of the world, they know that there is a king who is going to bring justice. And they will see the one who will someday come to the earth and repay every man according to his deeds. And in fulfillment of that promise, we have, again, the vision of the Transfiguration, which I think would be the gratifying fulfillment of that promise. Emphasis on the word gratifying. As I've already discussed, a lot of people, they read this and they think of the second coming. They think of the full culmination of that kingship rather than a preview of that kingship. And sometimes the instinct is, or the inclination is to say, oh, well, it's just the Transfiguration. He's just promising them this brief preview. It's not the second coming, it's just this. As though you go from something great to something, something not really important. Kind of a disappointment. Well, the thing is, that's not really the way that I think we should read this. In verse 28, Jesus promises something good, something which stands in contrast to the suffering that these men are destined to endure in this church age in which Jesus reigns from heaven and not really intervening to counteract the wickedness of the world. The disciples are going to experience the full brunt of that wickedness while Jesus reigns in heaven. It's like, okay, Jesus, what do we get here? I mean, we're your servants. I mean, we're the faithful ones. I mean, what do we get? Well, they get this vision, this good vision of things here, as I think a comfort to them against these things that Jesus just told them about. Now, maybe to help you think of it in this way, I'm going to reread the account of the Transfiguration. I want you to bear in mind what the disciples were just told about the kind of fate they're going to have, at the hands of wicked men. But I also want you to imagine, in contrast to that, the blessedness of this scene. And also you might be thinking about what the second coming will be like when that happens. Kind of string all these things together. The plight that the disciples know they're going to face on the earth, the goodness and the blessedness of this scene of the Transfiguration, and what it shows us about the eventual return of Christ and the glory that will be there in that day when it comes to judge all men. Okay, here we go. Verse 2. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his garments became white as light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him. And Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 tabernacles here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. He says, let's all stay. Let's just stay here. While he was still speaking, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and behold, a voice came out of the cloud and said, This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. And when the disciples heard this, they fell down to the ground and were terrified. And Jesus came to them and touched them and said, Get up and do not be afraid. So, maybe starting in reverse order, I hope your view of the second coming is informed enough to see the parallels here. I mean, how much this truly is a preview of the full culmination of Jesus' kingship when he does return. You see Christ present in all of his glory, shining like the sun, whiter than light. You see God himself directly speaking to the faithful. How many times do you think Peter, James, and John had God speak to them directly? None at all. And how now God shows up and says something to them. That's pretty impressive. Saints from the old times are there. Moses and Elijah showed up. I mean, you read about these guys, you heard about these guys in the synagogue all your life. Moses and Elijah. And now guess what? They're here. They just kind of show up randomly. And then there is such this overflow of emotion that they just collapse in fear. I mean, they're terrified. It's too much. They can't handle it. That's what it's going to be like when Jesus returns to reign on the earth as the undisputed king, repaying to all men according to their deeds. Jesus was true to his promise when he made this promise that they're going to see him coming in his kingdom. Peter, James, and John saw Jesus coming in his kingdom. It might have been a preview, it might have been a very brief thing, but they saw his kingship. They saw the glory of the king. Jesus did not promise those 3 men something and then switch it out for something less. He gave them something very good. He showed those men exactly what it will be like when he comes in the culmination of his kingship. Therefore, all of that to say, in my second point here, the Transfiguration really is a preview of the kingship of Christ. It really is a glimpse into the future of what his kingship will be like when it is fully realized. It's like traveling into the future, which sometimes you probably want in the middle of your difficulties. Whenever you're in the middle of a trial, you just want to know that it's going to end well, right? You just want to know that once you get through all this, things are going to be fine. And you wish you could see into that future, and you'd be comforted by that. Well, in the Transfiguration, we have that view into the future. We have that comforting look into things that are going to come to pass eventually. The only difference between the scene on the mountain and the scene when Christ returns is that when Jesus returns, it will not be limited to a mountain. It's going to overflow over the whole world. It's going to take over the entire earth. That's the only difference. But otherwise, what you saw on the mountain of Transfiguration is exactly what you're going to see when Jesus returns. And this thing, to see it, for the disciples to see that, having just been told of all the things they're going to endure, but then to see how it's all going to end. Jesus in glory, all of them together. Lord, it is good for us to be here. That's how it ends. That would be a tremendous, weighty thing for those disciples, which is why Jesus gave them this preview of his kingship, and which leads me into my third point for tonight. Okay, so first of all, just to recap this, you have this promise in Matthew 16, verse 28. Truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. That is a promise, as I argued in point 1, that they are going to see him transfigured. It's the transfiguration that Jesus is promising, which is narrated in the following verses. And then my second point, the one I did just now, is that the transfiguration is very much a preview of the coming kingship of Christ. It is very much a preview of the kingdom glory. And I gave you my reasoning for that. Now, my third point here, through the transfiguration, God gave these men exactly what they needed in order to face persecution. God gave them something that would actually help them, and exactly the thing that would help them as they face the life of trial that Jesus just described in the prior verses. That is what I meant at the very beginning when I said that God is exact in his mercy. He gives his people exactly what they need to face what they are going to face. Let's remember again what happened just before this promise of seeing the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Let's back up to verse 21, actually. It says, from that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed and be raised up on the third day. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord, this shall never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's. Then Jesus said to his disciples, well, let's just stop there. Jesus just announced that he is going to suffer and die. So Jesus, he's not getting off easy here in what's coming up in his future. He is going to suffer and die. And as though that were not enough, Jesus then tells his disciples that they all must be willing to do the same thing, because the same thing is going to face them whether they like it or not. Verse 24, then Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever, follow him to the death. That's where he's going. That's what he just said. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Peter did not respond well to the news of Jesus' horrible death. So how well do you think he responded to the news of his own horrible death and the death of his friends? How well do you think any of those disciples responded to this news that they are going to face crosses, that they're going to have to take up their cross and follow Jesus to his suffering death? You know, Jesus makes promises here in these verses about keeping your life after death and the final judgment and all of that. And, you know, maybe those might be somewhat comforting now, but they're all going to seem probably pretty abstract when they start carrying those crosses to the place of their death. when it really comes down to it, and the pain starts, and doomsday has come for them, those things, those promises, might just seem like words in their head. What these men need is something a little more tangible to help them accept this hard truth. Something that's going to help them get over this initial shock here of these things, and also carry them through the rest of their lives. So what is God going to give them? Well, in the Transfiguration, God provides that to each of these men according to their own unique needs. Emphasis on unique. We're dealing with individuals here, not just disciples in general or men in general. We're dealing with men and their unique needs. Let's start, as we assess that, let's start with Jesus. Not a disciple, but Jesus himself. Jesus needed this vision of himself to encourage him on the road to Jerusalem. Please do not forget the man bearing the weight of the whole world on his shoulders. Please do not forget that Jesus is actually enduring these things and bearing these things all this time. And he's the one that actually has to go forward with this, knowing what he's going to face. Jesus is the person in need of the most encouragement at this time. As Jesus tells his disciples that he is about to die, the weight of that is weighing on him as well. He needs encouragement too. And as the cross gets closer and closer, his spirits are going to get lower and lower. That burden is going to get heavier. And he's going to need more and more comfort. Don't forget that scene in Gethsemane where you see him sort of maximally weighed down here, how he describes himself. Matthew chapter 26, verse 38. He said to them, "My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death." It's like the crucifixion may not have to happen. I might die right here, right now. "I am deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch with me." How many times do you see Jesus beg people to stay with him? Don't leave me. Just stay here, keep watch with me. I mean, he is low at this point. He's low at this point here in terms of his spirits. That's Jesus' mood as he approaches the cross. That's the load he's bearing. Jesus, like anyone, needs something to keep him going, which means God has to give him something to keep him going. And God answers this need by showing Jesus the glory that he will have after he endures that cross. He shows him this in the Transfiguration. Jesus really had the front row seat there. I mean, he was the one to whom these things were happening. Jesus got to see that glory that he had before the foundation of the world and that he would have again. And in this, there would have been great encouragement. It's a lot like that verse that we often quote from Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2. It says, "Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who, for the joy set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." For Jesus, the Transfiguration was a literal view, a literal preview of the joy set before him. This joy set before him became something he could see and feel on the Mount of Transfiguration. And Jesus moved forward in that joy. As he went on toward his death, he could draw upon this for courage. Imagine how much lower he would have been in Gethsemane if he had not had this vision of himself, this vision of the joy that was set before him. So Jesus moved forward in that joy based on the Transfiguration. Now, back to the disciples. The three disciples needed to see this vision for their own unique futures. Peter, James, and John had their own unique futures, and for those futures, they needed to see this event. In the Gospels, I record a few incidents like this where Peter, James, and John get to see things that the other disciples do not. It doesn't happen often, but it happens enough that it's notable, that these three are the true inner circle for some reason. And the Transfiguration is one of those more private occasions where just these three get to witness something important in the life of Jesus. And the question is why? Why do only these three get to see the Transfiguration? Why do only these three get to see Jairus' daughter raised from the dead? There's some of these other events where only these three. In the Garden of Gethsemane, there was another one Why just these three? Well, my best answer to that question is that we have to remember the unique roles of these three disciples. In the future, these three do stand out rather notably. First of all, you have Peter. Peter, not too long ago in Matthew, was officially made the steward of the kingdom of heaven. He was made the right-hand man of Jesus. Jesus may wear the crown, but Peter is the one who holds the keys. The keys of the kingdom of heaven were given to him, which is a great burden to bear. He may not feel it now, but he's going to feel it in the future when he takes on that role as the undisputed leader of even the 12 apostles, which he very much was. If Peter is going to be the rock, he must be rock solid in faith. Otherwise, he's not going to be able to bear up under those burdens. This vision would help. Knowing, seeing Jesus revealed in his glory, being able to draw upon that memory would help him. And then you have James. This is a fact much forgotten, but James was the first of the 12 apostles to be killed. These men here who are doomed to face these terrible deaths that Jesus lays out for them, James was the one who met that end first. You see it in Acts chapter 12, verses 1 through 2. Now about that time Herod the king laid hands on some of them who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them. And he had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword. He was the first one of the 12 apostles to be killed. If any of these 12 needs to become mature in faith very quickly, it's James, because he's the one that's going to face death before any of the rest of them. He has to have kind of a growth spurt here. And through the Transfiguration, he has that. He gets to see these things before anyone else gets to see them, seeing Jesus in his glory like this. And finally, we have John. John is the only one of the 12 disciples to die a natural death. The only one who did not have to take up a literal, well, some of the others didn't have to take up a literal cross, but they all died still. I went through that in an earlier message, how the other disciples faced deaths as martyrs. Well, John, he had a natural death, which may sound fine at first, but John is going to have to hear report after report of all of his old friends being killed, knowing that they're being killed for the same reason that he could be killed. And he lingers on there, hearing all this news of his friends. And the last part of his life is actually spent that way in exile, if you remember. Exiled on the island of Patmos, where he received the Revelation, the book of Revelation. So there he is, an old man, John the Elder, as he calls himself at times, kind of whiling out his final years in exile, the only one left, kind of the last of the apostles, outlived his time, you might say. That's his end. I think something a little special for him would be helpful in those final years. And maybe in those final years he could reflect upon this preview of the kingdom of glory, that he saw in the Transfiguration to strengthen him. These three men all have unique futures with unique trials, and for those trials, God gave a special grace. He allowed them to see the kingdom glory of Jesus long before anyone else. Let's turn again to what Peter says about this. You kind of see him argue in this way. 2 Peter chapter 1 again. 2 Peter 1:16. So let's ask Peter a question here. Peter, is it all a lie? Is it all fake? How do you know anyway, Peter? How do you know this stuff is real? And why do you suffer so much under the burdens of your ministry, under something that could all be just wrong? How do you know, Peter? Why face the awful death that you know is coming? Jesus told you specifically how you were going to die. Why face that, Peter? What's going through your head? Well, we did not follow cleverly devised tales when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. Okay, he asserts we did not follow cleverly devised tales. How does he know that? But we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. For when he received honor and glory from God the Father, such an utterance as this was made to him by the majestic glory. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. And we ourselves heard this utterance made from heaven when we were with him on the holy mountain. Peter knows that the gospel is not a cleverly devised fable because he saw the kingship of Jesus fully revealed. Peter, how do you know Jesus reigns at the right hand of God? Because I've already seen it. He already saw it on the Mount of Transfiguration. He saw that glimpse into what was coming. How do you know Jesus will return to judge the living and the dead and make all things right? Because I've already seen it. Peter knows, and he can go forward in that joy of knowing and in that strength. And James and John did the same thing. James and John also had that same preview of this glory and could draw the same kind of strength from it. So that's those three. Now, how about the other disciples, the 9? As for the other disciples, they needed to hear of this event from faithful witnesses. They needed to hear of this event from faithful witnesses. It can certainly appear that the other disciples get sent to the kiddie table on this one, right? You go over there, just kind of chill out down here at the bottom of the mountain. Argue with this crowd that's coming. This crowd that's coming with this demonized boy. They're going to ask you to heal him, and you're not going to be able to, and you're going to get really frustrated. You just stay down here and do that. We're going to go up on the mountain. We're going to do something up here you can't see. It seems really unfair to them that they get left behind in all of this. What you have to remember, though, is the troubles they face in their own futures were not the same as those faced by Jesus, nor by the other 3 disciples who saw the Transfiguration. Even among the apostles, there are uniquenesses, and not all of them are headed in the same exact kind of future. God gives mercy according to the need. Jesus needed a certain amount of mercy in a certain way. Peter, James, and John needed a certain amount of mercy in a certain way. And the other disciples also needed mercy, but in a different sense. These men do have a hard road ahead of them, maybe not like Jesus, maybe not like Peter or James or John, but they do need something. God has to give them something to help them go forward as apostles. At the very beginning of the church, doomed to face martyrdom, He has to give them something. And so God arranged things so that they would hear of this event from men that they trusted, men that they knew they could trust. Peter, James, and John were men well known to the other disciples. Undoubtedly, they were friends, they were companions, they were co-workers. Also, they make 3 witnesses, don't they? By the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses shall a matter be confirmed. So here you have 3 trustworthy men known to them who can testify to them of what they saw. And of course, Jesus does not allow them to say anything until after the resurrection, but presumably, after the resurrection, they told the other apostles what they saw. They saw a preview of this kingdom glory that Jesus now has at the right hand of God, and which He will have in full when He returns to the earth. They were able to tell them these things after the resurrection and encourage them with those words. And those 9 disciples would be able to move forward in that joy, being strengthened according to their own unique needs. Differently from the other 3 disciples, yes, but still very much their needs being met by God. So through the Transfiguration, God gave these men exactly what they needed in order to face persecution. The Transfiguration was a means to an end. It wasn't just oh, hey, look what I can do, Transfiguration. No, it actually had a purpose. It was meant to strengthen these men against these terrible things that Jesus said was going to come upon them. So what does that mean for you? What relevance does this have for those of us sitting here in this room? Well, I suggest to you that you could probably go a very long way by considering God's treatment of the other 9 disciples who did not see the vision for themselves. Consider those men in particular. I, for my part, am glad that most of the disciples were not given this vision directly. I am glad that they were left behind at the kiddie table and not allowed to go up on the mountain. I'm glad for that because it allows them to represent us. They probably felt the way you feel very often in the Christian life, like you're being left out. The Bible has so many extraordinary events, doesn't it? So many miracles, so many visions, so many times where God just intervenes wonderfully. And we fill our minds with these things as we read the Scriptures. And we get to thinking, this is what it is to serve God. we inevitably think that we ought to see our share of the miraculous. We ought to see divine things very, very often. And we crave to see those things. But we don't. Very often it's just like ordinary life. Just wake up in the morning, go to work again, go to bed, over and over. Same thing over and over again. And you can feel like you're being left out here, like somehow it's just not connecting with you. The Bible is this and your life is this. Well, it's not really that way. A balanced and careful reading of Scripture shows you that even in the Bible, you don't always get a front row seat to everything God does. Look at the 9 apostles there, waiting on the bottom of the mountain. Like, what do you think they're doing up there? I don't know. Those 3 get to have all the fun. Just like they're just kind of left out here, waiting for them to come back down and move on to the next place. It's very mundane for them, these 9 disciples that are left there down there at the base of the mountain. They, like you, heard about the Transfiguration secondhand. I mean, they heard about it from faithful witnesses. We read about it from faithful witnesses, but still secondhand. So, were they weak in the faith? Were those other 9 disciples somehow stunted? Were they unable to face the deaths that were planned for them? Were they unable to face martyrdom for Christ's sake? No, they were able. Every single one of them, down to the last man, was able to face the deaths that were planned for them and were able to testify to Jesus in the way that they died. They were strong in faith. They didn't need to see it. Hearing about it was enough. Hearing about it from faithful witnesses was enough to strengthen their faith, and they persevered. So here you are, reading about God's great power, not always seeing it in your life, reading your missionary biographies and such, but not going out to live those things. But nothing's wrong. I mean, nothing's wrong with that, and there's nothing wrong with you because of that. That's not how your life is supposed to be. God's not holding out on you. He's not, leaving you on the sidelines here. That's not the way it works. God just gives you exactly what you need when you need it. Like the other 9 disciples, He gave them what they truly needed. They persevered. They had all that they needed to face what God had in store for them. And so do you. Even if you're not there witnessing miracles, you can rest assured God is very exact in His mercy. He's not going to shortchange you. He's going to give you what you need, exactly like He did to these men. And that, I think, is a great lesson from the Transfiguration. Not the Transfiguration itself, but its implications and the way it is used, if you will, here in Matthew's Gospel and in the other Gospels.